Now we will transition to our panel discussion. Panel members, please come up to the stage. So we will have, this panel discussion is about the future of neurocybernetics, whatever that means. So we'll define it as we discuss. And my job as the moderator would be to guide the discussions so that we can have some exciting engagement with the audience. So we strongly encourage you to ask questions, especially the trainees. We will have a QR code on the over here, which you can use to submit your questions. So please do so. Okay. Okay. So just to start, maybe we should start with a short introduction. So I'm Memming Park. I'm a PI here at Champalimaud Research. And I would perhaps 1 minute self-introduction starting from Eva. I mean, we don't really need a long introduction because we just saw your talk, but yes.
Hi, I'm Eva. You just saw my talk. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here to talk about, neurocybernetics at scale. And you saw my presentation, so we'll talk more.
Okay. I'm Escola. I'm also excited to be here. I'm curious to know the definition of cybernetics. I did look it up on my way over here this morning, since I have to talk about its future. I'm at Protocol Labs now, which is a research and funding organization that's targeting different technology areas, historically mostly in privacy and governance, but moving now into neuroscience with my joining the team. And we're doing a lot of different kinds of funding, but particularly we're interested in understanding intelligence generally and believe that scaled data sets will be a critical part of that pipeline. I have a PhD. I did a lot of work for it, so it's a little bit annoying that it's not represented on the screen. But I also do have an MD, so that's OK.
My name is Joe Paton, and I sort of have two hats as a scientist. I'm a PI here at the Champalimaud Foundation, originally trained as a biologist. I'm interested in the kind of circuit and computational mechanisms underlying behavioral control. And then I'm also the current director of the neuroscience program here. And so in that capacity, I guess I feel my role is to kind of try and think about how to maximize the impact of having researchers with diverse interests all working under one roof, and how can we gain benefits from more sort of collaborative, team-based kind of science, and so we've done a bit of thinking about kind of how to take the various researchers in neuroscience here at the foundation, who are all broadly share a common interest in behavior, and have what they're learning from their individual research programs kind of accrue to some more general understanding of the principles of behavioral control. So yeah.
Hi, I met most of you yesterday, or you met me at least. Adrienne Fairhall, University of Washington. So maybe just to add to some of the introduction from yesterday. So my background is in physics. My PhD and my undergraduate, which means that I take maybe a perspective on neuroscience that tries to extract a physicist's understanding of things, which is very much low dimensional. So I'm sort of maybe a bit on the sidelines of the data at scale world, but as both physically and mentally, because we're also neighbors to the Allen Institute, which is a fantastic institute that has been really propagating and developing data at scale. And so it's been very interesting to watch that happen and to try to see how we best take advantage of that data and how we train our next generation, right, to situate themselves well with what to do with that.
Awesome. You guys just met me an hour or so ago. I'm Jesse Marshall. I work currently at Meta. I would say at heart, I'm interested in probably the intersection of cutting edge and technology and science. I think through my PhD and postdoc work, I think I was always most interested in where these novel technologies can open up new domains and new frontiers, which currently is, of course, scale, foundation models. And I'll say on the topic of neurocybernetics, I did work a little bit before on sort of the intersection of natural behavior and robotics, like with some collaborations with like Google DeepMind. So I'm excited to see what this surfaces. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for your introductions. As you can see, we have a very exciting, diverse group of panelists here, right? With clinical interest, engineering interest, scientific interest, and also industry all represented. So to set the stage, we started organizing the symposium because we were thinking that, oh, this is the right time to start scaling up in neuroscience, because there are a lot of advances in neuroscience, as you just heard from this morning, of foundation-style models where you can integrate a lot of diverse kind of different data sets into exciting new kind of capabilities that we have never seen before with smaller scales. So I thought we would bring this into the scale, but at the same time, a lot of these foundation models are more focused on different kind of downstream tasks that are more engineering or applied, or perhaps clinical, and maybe less scientific. So I think there's a interesting discussion to be had about what should be our goal in terms of setting up, if we were as a community to bring together all of these efforts towards more integrated, larger scale modeling and data integration, maybe the cybernetic perspective where feedback loops, control theory, interacting dynamical systems versus these more feed-forward or perhaps more black boxy modeling approaches. How do we have to play this? Right, so this is an interesting question I think we should start with. So I would like to ask, what should be our goal to achieve as a community of neuroscientists, or as whatever background you have and your interests are? What are the kind of things you would like to achieve with this kind of neural data at scale? So I would say we could start with Adrienne.
Yeah, the physicist.
It's a relief, because I'm sure you're all going to say much more interesting things. So I will just start with my level of sort of maybe ignorance in that what I've always tried to do with the work in my lab is try to extract some version of understanding. And over the years, I've tried to map out what I think that is from my lab, and in little discussion papers. And to me, where understanding comes about is in the drawing together of the high dimensional mechanistic understanding. It's sort of a variation of Marian way of thinking about things, but where you really do know how the system's doing it, right? You have data from many different neurons, maybe. You understand the mechanisms, the concentrations of neurotransmitter, blah, blah, blah. You find some kind of low-dimensional description of that data, either analytically or through data analysis, and you tie that, right, to an understanding of what the system is trying to do. And many of us have made this point many times, that this is not the weather, right? This is a system that has a function, and so putting a function on top of this data set means that there is a meaningful question to be asked about what it is doing and why it's doing that. And so to me, understanding means bringing all of those things together. And I very much enjoyed the talks from the last session, particularly that tried to make that bridge. Here's the data, here's the complexity of it. Why is it doing that? And how do we pull that out of this tool that we have? And so I hope that that's where we're going to go.
If I understand correctly, you're trying to say data-driven approaches for extracting some normative principles, perhaps?
Or even one could imagine, right, coming up with normative principles and probing the data for them. It would be awesome, right, if AI gets to the point where it can extract those normative principles for us, and I think that we are getting there. But I still feel like there's plenty of room for the investigator in the loop, right, of using human creativity, right, to figure out what might be the principles at work, and then seeing if we can find evidence for them.
Anybody would like to follow up? Jesse seems to.
I'll just chime in. So certainly, I said it in my intro, my interest is in understanding intelligence generally. But I think that there is a potential paradigm shift that's happening that we should be open to as a process towards understanding, which is through models that we don't understand. So it may be that we can take very large data sets and build predictive models. When I think of neural foundation models, I think of them as having like sort of 3 components. I think Eva touched on all of these. So they could be predictive in time, they could have fill-in across regions, and maybe most excitingly, they could even find some common latent space across subjects. If you have such a model, and then maybe if you pair it with a body, like we heard from Bing, and probably we'll hear more from Srini, maybe, I'm not sure, yeah. Then now you have a model organism with a model brain, and yes, we don't understand it, but we can probe it in ways that we can't at the same throughput in the laboratory. And you're the physicist, but I believe that in physics, this is actually a thing, right? You build really big simulations, and you probe them, and you understand now how the universe works. So like, I'm wondering if neuroscience will start to become a simulation-first discipline, and that will be a path towards understanding and insight.
Maybe just to be provocative, I will argue against that.
That's why we're here.
Yeah. Not that I totally disagree that there's a potentially very useful path there, but you know, one of the reasons I liked that the organizers chose the term cybernetics is because it brings control more to the fore, and ultimately all of biology in some sense, and certainly the nervous system, you know, it evolved for control. In the case of the nervous system, to control behavior and physiology of organisms in complex and dynamic environments under particular ethological niches and so on and so forth, right? So what these more kind of large-scale models, data-driven training approaches are doing is they're staying kind of squarely in the kind of more information theory part of cybernetics, which I think misses the main driving force behind the organization of the nervous system. There are all sorts of pressures that were placed on nervous systems that we're not placing on these systems that have to do with the fact that they were built to control an organism in real time, right? So they need to be very fast in real time. They need to be very data efficient, sample efficient in the context of learning, right? So I worry that if we just take data-driven approaches and we don't add some other things on top of that to make them useful, the models that come from data-driven approaches be useful stepping stones to more kind of interpretable functional models that perform the function that the brain actually performs in controlling behavior, that we're gonna hit a wall. We're gonna get to where we get with LLMs, which are very useful tools, and all those things you had on your slide, Eva, in terms of, you know, how you can use these kinds of models in different settings. Those were largely tools, right, for data analysis or other things. But I wonder what are the right steps to take to go from those kinds of models to good models for how the brain works, right?
I just want to give Eva an opportunity, but real quick, I think the body is a key part of this, because then with a body in the loop, you are doing control.
Yeah, but you won't be able to control the body with a transformer.
Let's give Eva some chance to respond first. Yeah.
I wanted to say that, you know, as we saw in my talk, like, we're very much from this perspective of, you know, integrating many different diverse data sets, because we really feel like, well, there'll be potential to actually understand more about what the brain is doing by seeing all these different pieces. But I think that, you know, part of this fragmentation that we see in data also exists within our knowledge about the nervous system. And so, you know, it's often really hard to read a paper outside of your subfield because there's so much terminology and, you know, really dense information that all of us know. And the question is, how do we both integrate our data sets, but how do we start to integrate this knowledge that we all have that is still fragmented? And one thing that I'm really excited about in terms of science and understanding is a lot of new work coming out of, using LLMs and generative AI to do hypothesis-driven scientific discovery. And a lot of that comes from actually looking through the literature, looking at all the things that we know that we've written about in our papers, and starting to synthesize that knowledge base. And my belief is this is such a complex problem that we will really need AI to help us, both in terms of integrating the data, as I said, but now linking it back to what people know about the nervous system. And I'm really excited about a lot of new approaches where people are trying to I recently saw an exciting talk from Kim Stackenfeld. We're also thinking about doing this, but where you can actually use LLMs and generative AI to create hypotheses, generate programs that might tell you about your data in an interpretable way, because the building blocks that you've given it are interpretable and are understood by us because they've been communicated through our work and through our papers. So really, I see the early phases of this that we're all developing as a way of taking data that is always incomplete, because we can't record from every neuron in the brain, or we can't record all the neuromodulators and all the other signals going on. Our data is going to be incomplete, and so my perspective is that we need AI, we need tools that can take this incomplete data and put it into some format that we will be able to actually understand in a global or kind of more unified way. And so I think, yeah, definitely the next step, the next phase of this is starting to come back into the science and really see how we can distill this information into models of mechanism or whatever. And then the last thing I'll say is that we also have written a perspective piece recently that kind of almost flips it on its head, which is to say, many times we've tried to understand with our own minds what complex systems are doing, and we're limited by what we can envision within our own brains. And so I think having this perspective, like we're gonna come at it and know exactly the right question or the right way to look at our data, is also perhaps, something that we can try to go beyond and think a little bit differently. That maybe there's things that we don't yet know how to explain or understand about the brain. Yeah.
No, that's a fantastic perspective. Really combining the knowledge and make the loop. The science is a loop, right? As a experiment, theory, and data. So I think that's a fantastic viewpoint that we might have missed in this cybernetic loop presentation. So maybe next time we need to invite somebody else. Not that I don't want to invite Eva. That didn't come out right.
Or maybe next time we'll have some of those results to share with you all.
Exactly. Sorry. Jesse?
I don't know that I have that much to add. I mean, I think they probably covered a lot of perspectives. I mean, I do think coming maybe from the outside, not having thought that deeply about neuroscience, right, is this idea of how do you break the data out of silos, right, where it's like the frontier in human capabilities, like the thing that's adding, hundreds of billions of dollars to the US GDP this year is basically only AI and scaling. And, I think that like understanding like how the field is going to build those data flywheels, like the next generation, right, you're looking at the Allen, and this is, it's a model. I mean, there's probably people from the Allen here, but it's at this point, 15 or 20 years old. It's built kind of in this head-fixed paradigm largely, or like that's kind of the origins, right? And so thinking about the body, I've come, of course, from like more natural behavior, like freely moving, right? Like, could you build a much more effective data flywheel in some of these cases to start to extend these types of analyses? How do you enforce standards for openness and really be able to leverage this full amount of data? Of course, like close ties to sort of themes in astronomy and astrophysics. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Wanted to just follow up on Eva's point, because I was exactly making that argument to a group that we're trying to write a proposal that to me perhaps the most surprising talk I heard at this meeting was Misha's, because holy shit, there's a mechanism by which neurons are affected by extracellular ATP. who in their RNN model ever incorporated a mechanism like that, right? And every day, every few weeks, we're seeing new mechanisms, right, that no one is even incorporating in their models. And so I completely agree with you that knowledge scouring and hypothesis generation is a really, I think, promising way to use AI.
I just wanted to follow up on Jesse's point. I think that we do have a major coordination problem in neuroscience, which is how to produce data at scale. It's not really consistent with the laboratory model of academic neuroscience. And I'm not even talking about like having homogeneous data in the same task. It's more just actually getting all the data in a place where you could ingest it into large models. And so in order, I mean, the thing that I think the ChatGPT moment has shown us, and that we're starting to see in some work like the ones we saw from today, is that when you get to a certain level of data scale, you start to have unlocks. And so we should be open to the possibility there's a huge amount of discovery that's possible when we get these large-scale models. But that's only going to happen if we figure out how to have this data flywheel like Jesse was mentioning, and how that's going to interface and interact with the existing structures that are kind of holding up the industry.
Maybe this is a good time to transition to more data talk. So perhaps I would like to throw this question about what kinds of data do we need, and how do we want to take all of these data that are hiding in places and collect more data if needed. Do we need to collect more data at all? Don't we have enough data? Do we need connectomics and all of this? So sorry for the connectomics people. So yes.
I guess one thing that I just wanted to share is that there has been, or I recently attended a meeting at the NIH. Obviously, people understand that this is, that AI can have a lot of impact in many different domains of biomedical knowledge. And I think that the biggest, like models, all that, but yeah, data I think is kind of the key. And I know that there's a lot of, support for building out more initiatives. I mean, we have things like Dandy Archive, which was funded by the NIH Brain Initiative, which has been a really great resource of data that we're also tapping into, because ideally, if you wanted to create like a very large-scale data set like they had to train LLMs, we'll need to likely take data from all places that we have access to, as well as some of these large efforts like the Allen and the IBL. And so we need support. We need ways to actually store and access these data. And so it is exciting. There's a lot of discussion of how to enable this type of large-scale training. And yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. It is exciting to see that there's more recognition that this is an important part of this problem.
But do you think we have enough data already, or should we collect 10 times more data?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an empirical question in terms of like the scaling laws, and Jesse showed us.
I didn't see any saturation in your plots.
Yeah, there wasn't. I mean, there's some different results that are coming out where people are showing that, mainly we're like data impoverished, and so we can scale up our models if we have more data. But honestly, the other big challenge is compute. So there's more data out there that we could be training on currently. Even within our own models, we could go to more scale, but in academia, we don't actually have the computational infrastructure that these large industry or these companies have. And so I don't know, it's hard. It's like maybe we do have enough data, but we don't have enough compute to even tap into the resources that we have.
I think it's worth mentioning CZI. They've been putting a lot of resources into helping people to scale up their data, to get that data online. So it's not a new problem or new awareness, right, that this should be done. And I do see just so much goodwill and enthusiasm among new investigators for doing this. It seems like the zeitgeist has completely flipped in the direction of sharing data. The Alan, just to defend them a little bit, I mean, the comments you're making are very much Mindscope based. They are generating new institutes, as we speak. So there's one already online that's doing much more complex behavior. I mean, not as complex as I would like. IBL didn't do as complex behavior as we all would have liked either, right? When you have to do something at scale, that tends to reduce the ambition, right, for what the task is. And that's where having bazillion small labs who are willing to share their data is really going to push that. And I think the courage that so many young investigators are showing in doing complex, interesting tasks is really going to help us a lot. And you showed beautifully how much gain you got from, instead of doing, again, the center out task, by doing kind of a random movement task. So just from that one change, right? So as we go to freely behaving, complex behaviors, we're going to really enrich that data set.
Maybe before the, I'll say, like, I want to echo, I mean, I agree with a lot of the sentiments here, the idea that there's going to be big unlocks, or you can imagine a large-scale foundation model as being sort of a different type of telescope, that many different labs or investigators can use. I would say, there's a question of money, right? Like, and, so we are able to do what we do because we're, trying to sell a product to consumers, right, to solve a consumer need. Are also attached to a large, like, ad organization. I do think, part of me, again, coming really from the outside, wonders, like, if there can be more of a focus on disease, right? And so a lot of these large-scale efforts coming from the IBL, coming from Alan, very basic, very mechanistic. And I think that, ultimately, one of the big missions of neuroscience is to treat disease in humans, is to alleviate human suffering, is to produce cures, is to produce therapies. That's also a way to get large governments to invest in the sciences, or other particular foundations. But I think that, like, if there was a way to align these efforts of, like, how do we provide scaled data, but with a focus on a disease application. I mean, you think about the classic examples of, like, going to the moon, right, where you're, like, aligning behind something that was sort of a societal goal, but then as a result is producing a large number of technologies or spin-offs or other satellite deployment technologies, what have you. To me, that feels like one route to be able to achieve that scale for science, while also addressing what is, like, a really core mission for the field.
Interesting point. Maybe Joe has a
I just think
counterpoint to this?
Safari
Oh,
is a
sure.
great, the Simons
Go first.
Foundation Safari is a great example of that. They've been funding autism research and generating data sets for a while, and I think that's, they have managed to coordinate labs all across the US at least to do that.
Effort from the Rayner Cerebellum project to also build foundation models for understanding adaptive control of DBS. So I think there are a lot of these kind of growing efforts now where people are seeing the power of these types of approaches and trying to tackle it from disease models. But I mean, yes, that's where a lot of the funding comes from. So being able to talk about disease is important, but also to talk about disease, we need to know what the normal brain does too, potentially. So
I've thought a lot about this in the context of the BCI community, actually, since Protocol Labs has been doing a bunch of funding in that space. And a developing consensus is actually it contravenes your intuitions, at least according to some people's view, which is that the medical focus is insufficient to fund the industry, and that the BCI companies need other sources of capital in order to be able to continue to develop the devices that ultimately will help patients. And so there is an interesting question right now of whether or not those incentives can be aligned with AI companies trying to use neural foundation models or whatever to improve the human-like nature of their model performance. And so you could imagine a scenario where companies like Meta are able to fund into the BCI communities, not because they're trying to solve paralysis or provide function for paralyzed patients, but rather to have data for their models. but that, as a consequence, they're able to fund the device development that will ultimately help the patient. So it's unclear the directionality, but I think it's an interesting and open question.
So even though I was playing the devil's advocate before, I mean, I totally agree. As you know, we worked on a proposal to do exactly, what Eva was saying we need to do in terms of finding ways to bring data together at large scale in order to generate understanding or applications. But I guess I will still play devil's advocate in the sense that there are some people who argue that we're kind of drowning in data, that the overabundance of data and techniques with which we collect it has actually led to a kind of dearth of thought. Like that we somehow think data is going to take the place of theory and understanding, right? And so I think we need to be aware that it's both very important and useful to collect these kinds of data and figure out how to build things that are accessible to as many people as possible to maximize their impact. But we don't want to forget that there are there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done in order to generate real understanding. Now, what is understanding? I feel like from a neuroscience point of view, or from a scientific point of view, understanding is when you can take a really large set of apparently heterogeneous observations and sort of explain them with a very compact kind of principle set of rules, right?
Compact rules and principles for describing certain things. Like, do we really think that that's achievable, I guess?
Well, I mean, I
don't want to give up in advance on the hope that
Sure, but we've been doing a lot of that for a while, and now there's this kind of new emerging trend.
Yeah, so I don't think it's an either or.
Us, right?
I don't think it's an either or. Like, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be pursuing these. Like, when I first asked the question, I said, how do we make, like, I have my own interest as a scientist. It's more in understanding, although I'm involved in efforts to try and build applications. But I want to know, how do we, from a personal point of view, in terms of my own interests, take those kinds of models and use them to generate understanding. And if I look at, like, the nervous system, well, we've had the same basic organization of nervous system in vertebrates for 400 million years. Okay, what happened was that you had kind of expansion, duplication, specialization on a kind of basic nervous system plan that's been around for 400 million years. So that, and it's a relatively small number of kind of like brain systems, right? And they all have specific circuit motifs and cell types and, biochemical and molecular kind of characteristics. So it suggests that they are doing something specific, right? And then often those things are repeated over and over again. So it suggests that because these things are repeated, there might be a relatively small number of descriptions of the parts of the system. And if you understood how they were integrated together under the kind of, what I would argue are control objectives of the whole system, that would be the kind of thing that I would say is understanding. And I think that it seems self-evident that that's out there for the taking if we work hard enough on it. I don't buy the argument that there are no compact descriptions out there.
I think that's going to be a continued tension in the field for a long time until we actually fully understand the brain and they're like, oh, and there's nothing else to do. But for now, we have good job security. I would like to bring some
Speak for yourself.
cybernetics questions that were asked by the audience. So there's a question about, there were many talks about the role of control theory in neuroscience that have been about how the brain acts as a controller to interact with the world through the body. Any thoughts on how we can mechanistically understand and model the brain as such a plant, which we can enact control, as I believe this capacity is a show of good understanding of any system. Yeah. And can we do this in a data-driven way? Yeah. Anybody? Maybe Jesse wants to go first.
Great. And I'll also just say quickly to respond, Sean, with disease, obviously, you can have a much broader frame than just BCI. Like, I sort of agree with you, invasive BCI, but like if you think depression, anxiety, should I drink coffee? like it feels like those are kind of in the wheelhouse of neuroscientists, but if not, certainly not in the zeitgeist. Mechanistic systems focus. Yeah, I guess, I don't have like a super deeply held conviction on, obviously like, you've seen these sort of like biomechanical simulation and how these sort of deep learning approaches have kind of accelerated your ability to both model behavior, virtualized animals, virtualized real behavior compared with nervous systems. I mean, I think that the frontier that really excites me now is, of course, like robotics has also, moved on quite a bit in the last 5 years, right? Where you can start to use much more high-level instruction planning. And so I think there's probably an open question when thinking about neural systems and what sort of representations are good at explaining them. It's like, should we be having a more high-level understanding of like the affordances of in an environment that an animal could use or a person could use, and integrating that. So go beyond the body, thinking about the affordances present, right? Like if the control paradigm for the robot that will soon be able to fold my laundry is like a high-level instruction that can be passed and then, through certain large language model layers, is there something similar in an animal domain where it's like actually many of the representations are at that much higher abstract level?
I just wanted to add, not so much on the control side, but the importance of the body and embodiment. I think a lot of neuroscience has been driven by perception, right? Because we can see what we're presenting, or we can see the actions as well, which is not perception, but movement. But things that are kind of observable that we can relate to the brain's activity. But there's also a lot of interoception and a lot of signals that the body is giving the brain. And I think part of our models hasn't been able to really capture that or treat some of those different things because we haven't had the recording tools to measure different neuromodulators or some of these signals coming from the body. But yeah, I mean, it's all a brain body, it's an integrated system. And so it is exciting to think about how the new tools in recording those different signals will also give us maybe new modeling approaches and completely new insights into brain function. And so I'm really excited about this like embodied intelligence perspective that Bing and others are pushing forward on. And I think also just new ways of capturing, fine-grained muscles and facial movements and all that will probably be rich data that we can use to build models of brain function.
To me, I feel like the challenge that this is a subset of, the question of control is question of what are the boxes that we put around our very high-dimensional description in order to form the variables that are doing the computations that we're trying to identify. And control is a formula, a framework, right, that helps us to think differently about it. It's a piece of dynamical systems. I sometimes worry that we understand dynamical systems well, right? We're at the end of 30 wonderful years of great math, right, that's gone into that. We're very comfortable, right, with the vocabulary that we're given by attractor networks and by the tool, the psychological mental tools that they give us to think about how computations may be done. I think we always have to be careful that we're not painting ourselves into a corner in which some of the real things that are going on don't live, and I love all of the work that's being done in this, but I think it's just always good to keep there's a window open to there being some way of thinking about these computations that we're sort of not taking into account in our formulations.
Yeah, and if I could just follow on that, I mean, I guess one significant question I have is what is the right kind of abstraction level to try and capture, brain function, right? I mean, this ends up being a practical concern, right? Like we talked about the need for compute, right? Well, there are 70 million, neurons, give or take, in a mouse. Okay, so if you wanted to build like a model that was like one-to-one with artificial units and mouse neurons, well, you need 70 million units. We heard a talk about the interaction between astrocytes. Okay, so now you've got, you've got a scale-up number. They can make up to maybe, 10,000 connections or something like that. So now you've got a model that even at that really limited abstraction level, okay, is in the hundreds of billions of parameters range. And then you've got all the layers of biology underneath, right? And you've got all the structure of neurons, and you've got, you know, all the different molecular processes and neuromodulators and timescales and all this stuff. So you're quickly going to get into a regime where you're talking about models that far outstrip, you know, the scale of even the largest frontier AI models we have today. And so the question is, like, kind of, is that a problem? Can we arrive at the right abstraction level to reduce the scale of those models and still have them provide either useful functionality in the case of applications or useful understanding in the case of science? So that's one question I have.
I guess this naturally leads to the question of, you know, model structures. What kind of models do we want for interpretability? Is it the same kind of model structures that can capture principles of neural computation across species and across different scales versus the ones that are most useful for, let's say, medical applications? There will be some overlap. Is there, you know, are they fully overlapping? Do we utilize like self-supervised learning that we often use for different tasks, for all of these kind of different downstream tasks? Which ones can give us this kind of abstract understanding? So if anybody has any input.
I mean, I don't know that I have anything really intelligent to say on this point. I think this is an open question that's really a very, very interesting one. Certainly, you can get a lot of mileage out of a transformer, but we also know that a transformer is not how the brain implements its algorithms. So it's there's you know, and why are we using transformers? I mean, Eva, correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but they map well to GPUs, and they don't have the vanishing or exploding gradient problem the same way that RNNs do. And so that's an engineering solution to be able to build something at scale. Are there aspects of intelligence that we care about that we cannot extract from a model that is implemented as a transformer, but that we could extract from a model that's implemented in a way that's closer to the underlying hardware and wetware, I should say? And then to Joe's point, I think one of the things that's very interesting about trying to scale up to the size of a whole mouse brain, for example, is the hardware that will be needed to do that. And there are increasing efforts now to build analog circuits rather than digital circuits because they're much cheaper if you can get them to work. So I think there's a lot of interesting questions about how we're going to get to these scale models and what the implementational details will look like and the compute that's required to drive them.
You know, I think that we have to, like, maybe one issue with, you know, neuroscience, now that I'm like sort of outside the field that I can say the issue. There's problems at many different scales, and it feels like some of this conversation we're kind of arguing about whether we should study the retina or study like an animal foraging or like studying visual, like, I don't know, if you go back to astrophysics and astronomy, right? Like, there's physical principles that allow you to kind of focus your attention, right? So like if you're trying to model the expansion of the universe, you aren't going to worry that you have to simulate every molecule in the universe as well, right? And then there's different people that are going to like study the structure of atmospheres on Venus, and then, you know, and so like, and there's a sense of like, okay, well, at what scale, like what approximations are relevant, and you have that physical intuition that can like guide the relevant model, and also like understand the separation of different problems and like also how they interrelate to one another. And I think that you know, that I think that, yeah, there's still a challenge. It strikes me like that we can't completely separate things, and so we can't just say, okay, we've understood bird song and like that'll be its own kind of subdomain and like understand where each of these pieces relate to one another. It's like when you have this animal in a behaving body that like sometimes you start to worry that they all blend together and you can't separate them. But it seems like we need to at least have some acceptance of like what level of modeling is going to be appropriate at these different scales.
I guess to me that's the problem with biology compared to physics, is I don't think there unfortunately is a separation. You can take a drug, you take a pill, and it completely changes. It's a molecule, right? And it changes everything about the way your brain works. And so I wish we had a separation of scales like that, but I think that is the fundamental challenge.
I just wanted to add to some of Sean's points about new architectures that could be more energy efficient. I think we're all seeing, the amazing capabilities of all of these LLMs and generative AI. And at the same time, the amount of energy consumption from transformer architectures, especially at the scale that we're training on, is not sustainable for our environment. So I think there's a lot of efforts to, through engineering or through maybe combining with some state space models or hybrid architectures, which can kind of take long context and kind of more efficiently compress it down. But I think that this is a major problem, and the brain is, as we all know, very energy efficient. This has been something that I think people have understood and appreciated about what we can learn from neuroscience in terms of AI for a while. But then there was this whole revolution where it was like, oh, just scale up as much as possible. And I think that there is some reflection now on kind of looking back towards more energy efficient strategies, using spiking neural networks, right, which are able to only respond when input is over some threshold in the way that neurons do. But then to Sean's point, it's like transformers are really powerful because they can be scaled and optimized efficiently on our current infrastructure. And I think for some of these other models, the optimization is much harder. It's still challenging to get these architectures to work. But I think that this is a really important direction that we need to be going in, because, scale is all you need to some point, but like when we destroy the planet Earth because of all of these huge new data centers that they're putting up all around the globe, like this is gonna be a major challenge. And I just wanted to make sure that we said that at some point. Like I'm training these big models and doing as much as we can because we want to see the capabilities of it. But at the end of the day, like we're gonna need to find other solutions to move forward.
I'll just throw in that yesterday, some of you guys may have seen, DeepMind just released a paper on how to do fusion. So maybe this is not going to be a problem.
Okay, we won't need spiking neural networks after all. I don't know.
Okay. Well, can you perhaps go back to data and cybernetics? So there were several questions there in the field of asking about if these loops with the environment and the body are very important, shouldn't we be collecting more data in this context of interactive situations, and also perhaps utilize all of the great, wonderful musculoskeletal models that we have seen, the fish and the fly and the monkeys. Can we use this as data source for training our models? And how can we do this? Do we need to do this?
Yes. No, but I think I would go back to the thing that I was saying before. It's like, what is the right abstraction level at which to kind of describe that data, right? Are we talking about trying to reproduce all the different types of energies that are falling on different sensory organs, like in detail, while we're looking at a particular animal behavior?
I guess what I was trying to ask was, you can collect data from animal behavior and all of that, but you can also have this virtual version of it where you have an agent, right, where you're, perhaps a transformer style agent is interacting with the environment such that it's gathering information of how to interact, right? It's because if it's only trained passively by observed data and pre-collected
so you're talking
data,
about like behavioral task objective training versus data or prediction type objectives, passive training, right? Yeah. So I mean, this is what I was saying at the beginning, like bringing control to the fore and trying to posit like what are the kind of control objectives would naturally interact with that kind of approach. I think in a way that's potentially very powerful. So yeah, I think we should be doing that. But I do have a question. What degree of detail do we need the neuromuscular models to have in order to recapitulate the most important facts? Like, can we actually get a lot just by having, kind of like line models of muscles with particular, compact descriptions of their dynamics and things like that, and reasonable approximations, though much lower dimension, of the proprioceptive feedback. I don't know. I think it's a question.
So I want to bring up a point that Bing made actually in her talk, which I think is so important to this idea of if you're doing control, you need to know what the system is that you're controlling, what the inputs are that you have access to in order to design your controller. And what you can do with these models is you can infer some of the inputs that you couldn't infer otherwise, right? And particularly proprioception and touch. That seems like a fundamental capability that is unlocked. And yeah.
Sure. Can we get a microphone? Yeah.
Yeah, just to also add to this discussion, if you need sort of to understand the system well enough to be able to control it, and also for disease cases. I mean, in controls, you don't always actually need a very accurate. Well, you don't need a very precise model of the plant to be able to control it well. And so, as long as you have a good enough abstraction, which is exactly what we're talking about, it can be good enough. You can have uncertainties in the plant, you can have inaccuracies, and it's actually fine. So to that point, I think it's a very good question as to what is the right level of abstraction such that we can get to control it, especially in a disease case.
Maybe just one other point, because it hasn't really been mentioned yet, but you were talking about the power of virtual, physics environments. But my sense is, like, in the robotics literature, like, say, sim-to-real transfer works pretty well when you're talking about, like, really rigid environments, non-deformable, plants, and, manipulation of rigid objects. But once things start to get soft, crumbly, all the different ways in which kind of matter can have different properties, actually the sim-to-real transfer doesn't work as well, which may be an argument for actually building up more of a practice of robotics. The best model of the world is the world. So can we start working on, not just better virtual simulated, neuromechanical models, but actually better physical robotic neuromechanical models? And might that actually produce some unlocks in your Silicon Valley lingo?
Okay.
So that's a question I have.
So, Jesse.
Yeah, I won't say that much about control, but maybe more just like, we've talked about time series forecasting, we've talked about neural foundation models. Obviously, you're going to want to take that same approach to a lot of these embodied control problems, right? And like, there will be a point at which scale for these becomes important to identify what are the generalized representations. I mean, I think this is, so you're going to want to have 100 rats running around doing the lever, or 1,000 rats, if you actually want to be able to link your sparse neural samples with your sparse behavioral observations. If you're going to be able to interpolate across all those to make generalized principles, you're going to be able to need to embody some of these at scale, and then some of these representations are going to be much more crisp in that light.
Great. There are lots of questions that I couldn't go through. Maybe if you want to ask the question in as analog form, I was gonna ask. Do you have a quick comment?
Oh no, it's okay.
Okay.
Or actually, I just want to talk about bodies and stuff, just quickly. That if we have better models of the body, that might also allow us to do more in terms of understanding neural function across multiple species, right? Because there's like the brain, it's driving the body, but the body is different each time, and so knowing that should be helpful in that translation step.
Okay. We have an audience question here.
Yeah, I want to raise one point that was in the air here, which you might call the conceptual bottleneck, or our conceptual bottleneck. So, we think in low dimension, right? 2 bodies and 1 action, something like this. So the question here isn't all this, collecting a lot of data and large-scale data, etc., are not a kind of illusion, because we immediately, automatically, and maybe a priori reduce all of this to our low-dimensional thinking, conceptual thinking, And I wonder what do you think about this point, how much it limits us and how much it should guide our abstraction of what we
Very
get.
good point. Any responses?
I actually just want to add something to that. I think it's a really good point. I'm actually writing a review right now, and one of the things we looked at is basically the distribution of neuroscience experiments in the literature relative to cognitive functions as they're understood by cognitive scientists. And they're deeply biased in like a relatively narrow set of cognitive functions. And some of that is like maybe just because those experiments are easier, but I think part of it is actually our own intuitions, like our own subjective familiarity, which leads us to propose experiments in one domain rather than another. And so I think like actually as a field, we, in order to use this data, and Eva was saying that maybe AI can help us here to like not be trapped in our own narrow view of the world, but I think that the data will only be as useful as our creativity in being broad with our thinking about it, and we are actually limited by our own like narrow, low-dimensional thinking.
I guess one line of work in my lab that has made me feel like there's hope, right, for the approach of simplicity is work that we've done looking at dopamine signals in Drosophila, in birds, and starting to do that also in mice, where principles have emerged, right? And there was a dogma, and in some cases that dogma is correct, right? Dopamine is in fact playing a role in reinforcement learning. In some cases it's not correct. It's carrying all kinds of other signals that drive different kinds of plasticity rules that open our minds to what that might be doing. And this is a molecule, right? It's a quantity that's measurable, and sort of you can put a box around it and you can try to map its role onto a computational function. And I think that looking at it across multiple organisms, even without their bodies, right, has been very illuminating in thinking what the function of that quantity can be. And so that has, and even the work we've done on sensory adaptation, right? You see very common rules that pertain, to the way that neurons adapt across multiple systems, in multiple animals, multiple sensory modalities. And so I am, inspired to think that one can keep doing this, right? That there are principles that can be discovered even in the kinds of data that we have already. And so that's why I'm a little less sort of worried that there won't be more of that to be discovered, hopefully from the kinds of data that you guys are taking.
Maybe one final audience question from Carlos. Sorry.
Thanks. So I mean, in terms of actually thinking about what's missing in these models, right? What could be illuminating this dialogue between the modeling and computational world and the experimental world, right? So one of the big problems are the unknown unknowns, right? So we keep on doing things because that's what we know, but there might be this other dimension like glia or lactate or whatever, right? Which at the end actually is highly informative for the system. So to which extent can we use these models to identify unknown unknowns so that experimentalists can then actually go and look in that corner of the universe which we haven't actually explored yet?
I actually didn't hear the last half of your last sentence in your question.
How we use these.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
you were suggesting that.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to the previous question or what we were talking about before. I mean, I think that, yeah, we all kind of, we do the things that we know and continue forward, often, exploiting rather than exploring. Part of that is due to the cultural effect of like, oh, you need papers and, all these different things that have to do with the culture of doing science. One way to get out of that bubble is through collaborations and talking to other people that might be outside of your area. But there is some really exciting promise behind using LLMs that have been, fine-tuned on scientific literature to both summarize the knowledge that's known on certain topics, which can be really helpful just to even interface with it for the first time. And also I don't know, I play with ChatGPT all the time, and having them, ask new questions or take my work and, come up with new directions or things to test next. And some of those things, like even though it's been trained on things that have exist and things that are known, it's at least unknown to me, or maybe is, surprisingly powerful in its ability to, digest all of this immense knowledge that we have out there and potentially give us some, new insights into how we can go about doing our own science.
But can we systematize that, right? Can we create actually an engine which is specifically driven for that, right? Which kind of really allows us to go beyond our intuition.
I mean, I guess if you have a good train and test set, right? So if you can operationalize this and give it, give some held out domains, give some examples of unknown unknowns, then you could probably build a little chatbot buddy to help you identify where the domain gaps in a field are.
I think this is not going to be concluded with this. I mean, it's a very, very important question. But yeah, I think it's difficult to conclude. So maybe I'll just receive one more final.
I just do think that is the fundamental basis of creativity. Whenever you're taught what creativity is, it's the ability to look across domains, find things, notice something in one domain that you wouldn't have thought to apply it to another domain. So, hopefully that's what we all do. Hopefully when we read the literature, we're reading broadly, we're paying attention, we're looking for unexpected connections between our work and things that are outside our own domain. And I'm sure AI is going to be good at that, and I'm sure we'll find how to make that effective. But in the meantime, don't stop doing it yourselves, right?
Can I make one quick comment on this? I think that virtual neuroscience as a paradigm actually does unlock some of the sclerosis in the way that science is conducted, right? I think a common career trajectory is you have a big win, maybe even as a graduate student or a postdoc, and then you kind of iterate on that for the rest of your career. And that makes sense because of the cultural incentives that are set up. But if you had a really good model in a simulation that you could do hypothesis generation on at scale, you could maybe get much more conviction that a new experimental paradigm is going to be fruitful and would lead you to branch out and maybe do more discovery science faster.
Okay. We're running out of time, so maybe one final, very, very short question, if possible, up there. And we will conclude.
So hi, I just wanted to give my perspective because I came to I'm a computer scientist and I'm like a student, I'm like a new researcher, and I came to Champalimaud trying to solve this issue of marrying computer science and neuroscience, because LLMs are built to they were built for text, for words, for natural language processing, and they are big statistical machines, but they kind of create the scaling problem. But I came to neuroscience because I genuinely believe that neuroscience was the solution to the scaling issue, because the brain does compression at large scale. We can compress the information of our entire lifetime. So, but my issue as a researcher was trying to find information about neuroscience, because that was not my field of study. So I think that new ways to actually teach neuroscience and to actually create better tools for visualization, those are actually the things that can actually drive the field, because more people will be able to actually understand things quicker. And yeah, I think it will just make knowledge more democratic, so that we don't get basically our entire research in the companies. So yeah, and basically I just find it really difficult to find exactly what mechanisms in the brain allow brain to do compression so well. But if we could solve that issue, hopefully we could solve the compression issue, the scaling issue. And yeah, but I have lots of questions and I couldn't find any answer. So what do you think of this, basically?
I don't know if we have.
I don't think we know, but can I give my intuition?
Okay.
On that very quickly? I mean, I think one of the things that gives rise to the particular kinds of intelligence that animals possess, and at its pinnacle, say human intelligence in some ways, is that we have these very tall hierarchies for representation and control. And my sense of the current models is that they don't build that same height of hierarchical structure, you know, and that's why an LLM can't write a novel. Like we can keep a plot arc in a compressed form that maps to many, many, many low-level descriptions at like the word level, right? And that allows us to kind of write the novel, right? But if you're living fundamentally at the kind of low-level statistical structure of the input, or only like a little bit up from that, then it gets hard to do this thing that you're referring to. So I
Yes,
think it's about
exactly.
hierarchy.
So can I just say something? I would, like, for example, the data in the internet like flows through packets, and the data is very compressed. I would never like try to use a compression algorithm to try to understand the brain. And I feel like it's the same for LLMs. So like low statistical representations might not be, I don't know if they are like the solution. So, but
I think that's a big open question for all of us, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to answer more toward this direction.
I just wanted to your point of like, being a computer scientist trying to understand the neuroscience literature. This is something that we struggle with a lot in interdisciplinary research groups in general. And like, I do think that the power of just digesting some of this information and making it more accessible to people that aren't part of, the community necessarily. I think that could also be a really big potential for bringing in more computer scientists or bringing in people from, other fields of mathematics or physics that might be interested in the brain but haven't been able to, understand where to go within the space. So
that is exactly the core principles of cybernetics. And with that, let's conclude and thank all the panelists.